So let me quickly move on to our next guest, who I'm thrilled to have here because she's getting on a plane after this to go to Uganda for 3 months. Is that right? 6 months. Whew. So we are so thrilled to have Cindy Pelt. She is the Senior Advisor for Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance Policy Team in the Office of Foreign Assistance, better known as F. And she is going to be able to talk about basically how the resources works and how we bring this all together. I think she could probably comment on that last question. If we do have operational plans that we have to put out for every bureau, every embassy to be able to comment on what we're planning on doing with our funding, as well as everybody who has foreign assistance does that. But let me turn it over to Cindy, who I will say has been a great proponent of supporting the work that we do and making sure that we get the money that we need to be able to do our work. And so I'm very thrilled to introduce Cindy Pelt.
Hi all. Well, thank you, Pat, and thank you to DRL for having me here. I'm really excited to, this is the last thing I'm going to do before I get on a plane, so I'm really excited to be here. And I also want to thank all of you for all of the great work that you do. You're really the foot soldiers of our foreign assistance, so I really appreciate all of the work that you do to make sure that our funding is used effectively and also is in alignment with what we're trying to do as the U.S. government. So I have 3 real quick things that I am going to try and cover today, and I know I'm standing in between you and lunch, which is, you know, not an enviable place to be. So I'm going to kind of give you a quick overview of my office, F, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the overall trends in democracy, human rights, and governance foreign assistance over the past few years, kind of covering the Obama administration and then up to now. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about probably what's most interesting to folks is where are we right now and what does DRG look like within this administration. So with that, so my office is the Office of U.S. Foreign Assistance Resources, and basically what we do is this wheel on your right-hand side is how we kind of follow resources and align resources to strategic planning, as well as to operations out in the field, as well as ultimately to performance reporting and learning. So we start the process really with the agency strategic planning process. So we have the National Security Strategy, which is, you know, written over by the White House. And then underneath that, we have our joint strategic plan with state and U.S. aid. And then underneath that, we have our bureau strategic planning processes. So, and those also are joint in terms of regions. So the USAID, Africa Bureau, and the State Department Africa Bureau sits together and they write a joint regional strategic plan. And then ultimately out in the field, there are integrated country strategies, as well as USAID's own strategic planning process. And that then leads into and should inform our budget planning process. And so we build the budget from the ground up. So we ask our missions and posts out in the field, what are the resources that you're looking for? And then that filters into Washington, and the bureaus look at it. So the missions out in Uganda, Kenya, Togo, they are filtered into the Africa Bureau. Then the Africa Bureau looks at them, and then they submit a resource request jointly through my office, F. And so we take a look at it more broadly. We kind of understand what Congress is looking for. We understand what the Secretary is looking for. And we understand what the USAID Administrator is looking for. And we can hear what's going on with the NSC. And so then we try and pull all these different pieces together, and we try to make everybody as happy as possible, or to make people as equally unhappy, which is how it usually works. My former boss used to say, you know, go through the grieving process. If we can just get people to depression, then we've won. So then after that, we submit our budget to Congress, and then Congress does whatever they decide to do with our budget, and it comes back very differently than how the administration requests it, and then that's ultimately what gets submitted to, or is like given out to bureaus and embassies abroad, and then they write their operational plans, which it looks a lot different than what they had requested, because we have lots of congressional directives and earmarks that we have to now comply with. And then on top of that, there's obviously an overlay of what the administration wants to add on top of that. And then from there, there's actual implementation of programs, and then we have our performance planning and report process, where the field and mission, they do monitoring evaluations, and then that all actually eventually comes back to Washington through the performance plan. And that's how we try and justify why our programs are efficient and effective, and why we should still keep on investing in foreign assistance resources. So this is the picture of our 2017 budget. So I'm highlighting here, this is how much funding is going to democracy, human rights, and governance. And you'll see it's just 6% of our overall budget. And maybe I should also highlight for everybody here, although people probably know this already, is that foreign assistance makes up less than 1% of our entire federal budget. So this is the less than 1%, is the $36 billion. And then of that, 2.3 billion, or 6%, is what is dedicated to democracy, human rights, and governance. And as you can see, health, peace and security, and humanitarian assistance really make up the lion's share of our entire budget. And I'll also point out that this is just their 17 budget, but really the proportions are roughly about the same every year. So about 6% is about how much DRG shakes out to be. Oh, that blue line does not show up very well. So this is our global picture for DRG resources from the very end of the Bush administration up until today, our 2018 request. The very light blue line is what we actually get from Congress. That's the actual appropriation. And the darker line is what you'll see is that's the administration's request. So you can see it's kind of fluctuated, but from 2012 through 2015, there was a pretty big decrease in democracy resources, and that was when we were really making the argument to Congress that because democracy didn't have an earmark before 2016, basically what happened is there are so many other earmarks that the department and USAID had to comply with, and so those got funded first, and then in a sense really what happened to democracy funding is it was kind of the leftovers. And so you can see kind of how that affected the overall budget. It's because the overall budget was going down and there were more earmarks. And so when we had to fund those first, democracy was the one that suffered the most. So in 2016, the 2.3 billion, you'll see the bump up on the bottom there. That's the hard earmark that we have from Congress. And you'll see for 2018, the request is below that. It's $1.6 billion. And that's because our overall request for 2018 is significantly lower than we have had before. So as you might have seen in the papers, our foreign assistance budget is a third of what it has been in the past. So there's been a third cut. And that's also true for democracy programs. So in a sense, it was a proportional cut, so it wasn't that democracy ended up getting cut worse. It was just sort of, there's also a third cut to democracy as well. But looking at, if you've looked at the House or the Senate marks for 2018, it looks very much like we'll have a straight line. So the same 2.3 billion that we had for 2017 and 2016, it looks like that's what will also end up for 2018. This is just to give you a sense of the different program areas that we have within democracy. We have good governance, which is the lion's share of what we end up spending our democracy, human rights, and governance funding on. And then rule of law and human rights, and then civil society, and then political competition and consensus building. And that last one is where a lot of the elections strengthening and support goes to. And under civil society is where we see media, free flow of information. And this is the funding by region. And so South and Central Asia, which includes Afghanistan, is the region that receives the most funding. And that's because Afghanistan receives so much funding overall, as well as for democracy funding. And then Western Hemisphere, the Near East Bureau, Europe and Eurasia, Africa, or actually Africa, then EUR, and East Asia Pacific. And then we have our functional bureaus, which includes DRL, as well as the DRG Center over at USAID. So then here's the top 20 recipients of DRG assistance. So you can see Afghanistan. You can barely even see all the other numbers because Afghanistan is so huge. And then Mexico, Pakistan, and then it just kind of goes on from there. But Afghanistan is really what receives the majority of our democracy assistance. Okay, so looking at where we are right now. So for 2018, this administration came in and they told us that we needed to take a hard look at the budget, and we needed to make cuts, and we needed to reduce it by 1/3. So how do we do that? So through conversations with the 7th floor, which is our strategic planning and policy staff, kind of coming up with a framework for how do we make these cuts, what is important to this administration. And so these top, the darker blue at the top, defending national security, asserting U.S. Leadership and influence, fostering economic opportunities for the American people, and ensuring effectiveness and accountability to the U.S. taxpayer. These 4 pillars are what this administration has decided what's important for the State Department and USAID. And so we were left with, okay, well, how do we talk about democracy within this framework? And so we came up with talking points and went back and forth with kind of working with our regional bureaus, working with DRL, as well as the DRG Center over at USAID. Through a roundtable process, we came up with these broad talking points in order to fit our democracy programs into this framework. So under defining or defending U.S. national security, the argument for DRG resources really the underlying causes of violent extremism, terrorism, transnational crime, irregular migration, and so kind of thinking about our democracy programs as a means to help further defending national security through that lens. And so our rule of law programs, thinking about good governance as well as human rights abuses, all of these elements as ways of preventing terrorism or extremism. Asserting U.S. leadership and influence, there's somewhat of the argument of American values and democracy as a core American value, as well as the counter influence to Russia and to China, which is something that this administration cares about. And the economic opportunities and kind of looking at the prosperity lens is looking at kind of bolstering other governments in terms of their democracy, as well as because democracies are going to be better trading partners for us, and looking at corruption within other countries. And then the last pillar is the effectiveness pillar. So the idea here is really looking at the sustainability of all of our foreign assistance more broadly, and how democracy can really help actually further our funding to be more sustainable. So we're pouring a lot of money, as you saw, into health as well as into peace and security. Well, how do we make sure that that funding isn't just, that we're not just funding it year after year after year, but how do we make that more sustainable? So this is really looking at integration of programming as well as looking at the systems element and making those more sustainable. I think that is my last slide. Oop, sorry, we are not at lunch yet, sorry. Okay, so I was told we have about 10 minutes left for Q&A. So, and it looks like there's microphones on the side, so if you have any questions, I'm more than welcome to available to answer them. Did you have a question? No. Oh, okay, no, you're just sneaking out for lunch, I understand. Yeah.
I'm Tom Purikel with the University of Notre Dame. Understanding that especially on the last panel, they were also talking about a lot of the great work that our organizations do, but also especially our local partners, our community partners, and the need for kind of sustaining a lot of the efforts that we're working on. Thanks. And so it's just kind of a question of what balance do you think is appropriate as we submit applications to think about the institutional strengthening that needs to happen also of our local partners and everything that's asked of them, and just making sure that they have the systems and structures, personnel, security in place to be able to keep their work going on, and what's actually allowable and justifiable?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. But it seems like that's the new trend that we're sort of seeing is working on these systems. One of the things that is new this year is we were looking at the democracy earmark. And so kind of going back to this slide where we use the standardized program structure in order to actually come up with this information. So every mission has to put their funding in a box, and it's a health box, or it's an economic growth box, or it's a democracy box, and all of those are mutually exclusive. That's just how it got set up, and that's how we can click a button and we can figure out what the democracy number is, and it's all wonderful. Well, so this year, because we knew that that was getting to be difficult and our missions wanted to have more flexibility, and now that we have so many of these congressional earmarks and it's taking up so much of part of the pie, if we're able to double count them more, then there's gonna be more flexibility for our missions to do the programming that they want to do as well. So one of the things that we did this year as a part of the operational plan is we created this attribution key issue, which allows missions to count something as both democracy and basic education, for example, because that's another earmark that we have congressional earmark funding for. So if there's a program where the mission really thinks that it can meet both definitions, like it can count towards basic education, but maybe there's this integrated governance component, maybe they're working with the Ministry of Education on some kind of good governance and working on the systems, or working with civil society to help demand of their local government officials to include the right curriculum or something like that, where there's really truly a government democracy angle, then they're able to double count that. And that's kind of the trend of where we're going right now, is because we want to build that flexibility in, as well as there's this broader sustainability argument. Good question. Yes.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for your presentation. I'm Chantal Agarwal with the American Bar Association. I have a question going back to your the slide with the 2 lines, and it's just more of a clarification. So then, were you saying that for fiscal year 2018 that the request would be lower, but you were anticipating sort of the same? Okay.
So I know that that's kind of weird, because as you can see in the past, we've always requested more resources than we've received, and that has generally been the trend over time, is that we've requested higher, but then we receive lower from Congress. But this year, this administration has prioritized it's not necessarily that they haven't prioritized democracy funding, but just generally they have not prioritized foreign assistance as highly as other administrations have. So the overall request is pretty low. It's 1.6 billion, which is, well, I guess that's still higher than it was in 2008. But yes, we are expecting the same earmark, which is the 2.3 billion overall for democracy programs. I mean, assuming that what's in the House and what's in the Senate version of the bills that we've seen for drafts, if that holds true, that's what we're expecting. Yeah. Are there any other questions? All right, well then maybe I'll let you all go to lunch early. Congratulations, 10 minutes back in your life.
Well, again, thank you so much, Cindy.